Hi, I'm Michelle, and welcome to the Grateful Podcast, a place where we contemplate how we can eat, live, and lead each day to build a more sustainable world. On today's show, I'm chatting with Meret Brotbek, who is a climate activist and also a social entrepreneur. Meret's a director at Climate KIC, which is an EU-based knowledge and innovation community that tackles climate change. But I mostly spoke to her today about that second hat that she wears, the entrepreneur hat. So in this episode, she shares her experience as the co-founder and managing partner of a spice company called Sol Spice. And if you live in Switzerland or Germany, you may have seen their products on the shelves. They're not only beautifully decorated spice blends that look amazing, but they also have a really interesting story behind them. And Sol Spice was really created to showcase another way to grow, trade, and use spices, a way that's more ethical and sustainable and tries to create value for both producers and consumers. So today, Meret shares her journey that's taken her from being a lawyer to an MBA graduate to working at Unilever to eventually find her passion and calling at the interface of food systems and climate change. Preparing for this, I realized I have a bunch of your spices in my cupboard at home, not only because they're delicious, but also because you have this really beautiful packaging and it stands out and catches the eye. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the message you're trying to send with this lovely name, Sol Spice, and with the beautiful packaging that comes with it.
Essentially, it's in the name. So it's really spices with a soul. So spices who have a story, who are not just any spice, but really who really have a direct link to the origins. And the packaging is really reflecting the same. So every packaging has a unique pattern. And for single spices, that unique pattern is related to the country of origin of the spice. So we always then look for, when we create a new spice, and all the spices, for instance, from Sri Lanka, a single spices will have a Sri Lankan type of pattern. So it's really always trying to show that there is a link between the product inside and the origin of it. And in the packaging, for us, it was really important that it also looks very valuable, because spices are actually super valuable and have been, traded like gold in ancient times. And we really wanted that it looks like a little piece of jewelry that you have in your kitchen, and that you can really put it out and use it as decoration almost in your kitchen. So that's basically the concept behind it.
Yeah, lovely. And it's funny you say that, because I said I have them in my cupboard, but actually I have them lined up on the bench so that I can see them, because like you say, it's almost like jewelry for the kitchen.
And everyone does that. Everyone I know who has our spices really tries to put them out. So it really serves a little bit as a decoration in the kitchen when you come in. So that is, I think it can serve that purpose to enhance and embellish your kitchen decoration.
Not just the food, also the kitchen.
Exactly.
And you mentioned, that spices have been traded for the longest time. And that's very interesting, because when I think about spices, I immediately think about the spice trade. I think about colonialism, and I think about the influence that that's had on these value chains up until today, and especially who profits from it and the impacts from it. And so we have these products that have a kind of sometimes murky history and a lot of challenges associated with them. I'm really interested to hear from you what you think the biggest challenges are in the spice industry today, and how you're trying to tackle these with Sol Spice.
So the spice industry, I think, to this date, has been one that's been very slow to shift and change, and everything you say is absolutely right. So it has been a rather sad history. Like if you look at how spices were traded in the past, and even if you go to these countries and you see the history behind it, it is very closely linked to colonialism, to slavery, to very, very dramatic practices and oppression techniques that were used by Western countries at the time. And I think to this date, there has not been a huge demand for change, like on chocolate or tea. And that's principally because there is basically used spices everywhere, and almost every product that you buy, you will have some level of spices in there, because it's really the primary flavoring, but in very, very small amounts. And because of that, the consumers don't really care about which spices are in the product. And so there hasn't been a strong industry push. And then the big industries players that are in that only do spices, like McCormick and others, they are doing a little bit of sustainability, but it stays quite limited compared to other industry players. And there is not really a big push from the consumer to make that change. And I think so that leads us still today to have quite an untransparent industry in spices overall, a lot of price volatility, and actually for the farmers, a lot of unclarity on what is the price because of all these middlemen, high dependency on the market, which is really, really changing a lot. And then there is also for the consumer a lot of contamination. So really the practice of using a lot of pesticides and inputs in general for products in general, but also spices. But because spices really are not massively processed, they're plucked, they're washed, and that's it, more or less. So a lot of the residues then tend to stay on the spice. And that's why we really focus only on organic, because we believe that's really the only way to have unique quality. And it really makes a difference between traditional spices and organic spices at the origin, because it's a completely different agricultural technique and growing techniques as well, which is, if you buy industrial spices, just really not the same taste. And then the last problem, I think, that is not just with spices industry, but farming in general, but we see it a lot within our farmer groups, is that the population of the farmers is very old. So most of the people farming spices are certainly above 50, but often also above 60, sometimes 70, with no real next generation taking over, because the prices are so low and because there is not a real interest from the younger generation to take over. That creates a real problem of how will we manage having still good spices and good ingredients of agricultural raw materials in general in the next generation. That's just a brief overview of some of the things that we are trying to do differently in our project, but it is quite a challenging context.
That's what I find interesting about your model, is you are trying to tackle different aspects of this. So the agricultural production, but then also seemingly quite a lot on the social economic side. Could you tell me a bit more about the model you use and how you hope to have an impact?
Yes. So what we do differently, or what we focus on, is really working directly with farmer cooperatives on the ground, where farmers organize themselves into groups, own a cooperative, and that's we then work with these cooperatives directly. So this allows us really to completely get rid of middlemen and only work with the farmers directly. And that already removes a lot of pressure on pricing to make sure that everything we pay really then goes to the farmer. We also really then support the farmers in going into niche products and high quality, and that's also by really being very diversified on the ground. So having really regenerative type of agriculture where multiple crops grow on the same plot, so farmers really don't have just one specialty, and it's not an industrial production, but it's really grown almost. You really feel when you're visiting our farms that you're in the forest, where you have a mix of ginger and turmeric, which grow in the ground, mixed with pepper, which is a wine, or vanilla, which is another wine, or then trees, such as cinnamon or nutmeg. And this combination also allows the farmer, it has really a short, medium, and long-term investment, because all these crops grow in different time. So a cinnamon tree takes 4 to 5 years, a nutmeg tree even longer. So it also is a real investment strategy by the farmers. And we really try to push our farmers to be as diversified as possible. And lastly, what we do then in Germany on the production, so all the production or all the ingredients then come to our production center in Germany, which is basically a partnership there that we have with Rehabilitation Center, which particularly works with people who have psychological issues, particularly stress or burnout, who need a place where they can start reworking again and get used again to having a normal job, essentially. And there we have a very successful partnership since last year, where they manage our entire production. So we train them to do the mixes, they do the filling by hand, the etiquetting, and the entire sending.
Really interesting. It speaks definitely to the power of partnerships. And so from this work so far, what's a kind of story about how Soul Spices impacted somebody's life that's touched you the most?
So I think impact is always difficult, because when you're in the weeds of it, you don't necessarily see anymore what the big picture is. I do feel the biggest impact that we still have is that we were always able so far to pay a premium of at least 20%, but often actually 100%, on the crops on the ingredients that we're buying, and that we just really buy our raw materials at a much higher price than what the market is buying. And to give you an example, there is pepper, black pepper goes as low as €2 a kilo, and our farmers still pay 10 to 12 euros when they deliver high quality. And I think, again, for us, this high quality is very important, because if you do look at the market prices, it's just very, very difficult to differentiate. So we really work on acquiring and pushing the farmers to produce premium and to know how to increase the level of premium quality that they're able to produce. And through that, I still feel that for the farmers, the biggest leverage that you can have is improving the price of what he produces, because many other things, and that's the fundament of our work. And then obviously we would like to do more and look at how can we help support the farmers through other ways. But we feel getting the pricing right and consistently right, that's really the basis. And if we get that right, continue to get that right, I think we can really make a big impact on these farmers. And we see in many farm groups that are more or older, or that we also work with, all their kids are going to university, they have pretty nice houses, and you can really see that actually paying a better price or getting a better price actually makes a big change in the lives of these farmers.
Absolutely. And do you notice an impact, the farming communities that you work with, by paying a higher price? Are you noticing yet that that's making farming as a profession more attractive to the younger generations, or is that something that's too early to say?
I think it is too early to say, also because I think it goes together with so many other factors in a country. So I think it depends on what are the alternatives that are available. And I cannot fully understand that when farmers have sent their kids to university and that they're super educated, that it's difficult for them then to come back and be a farmer, because we also don't see that really happening in Europe. And I think the conscious choice of really that we see much more actually happening now in Europe, where younger generations are really interested of, not working anymore in front of a computer and want to go back to farming. That's still very limited, at least from what I can see with the different farm groups that we're working with. Because even if the conditions improve, it is still a hard life where you need to be outside, you need to do a lot of things. So I think, that's not, at least we can't, couldn't say that now, thanks to us, we have managed to convince so many new farmers, unfortunately, to move back in. And I think there would need to be much more people working like us in these countries to really start making a real shift in that place, unfortunately.
And I think it speaks to the importance of systems approaches too, that so much is interconnected. It's not just one intervention that's going to change a challenge that's linked to so many other systems.
Absolutely. We're just one piece of the puzzle, unfortunately, in the whole thing.
Absolutely. And so how has this work influenced you personally in terms of how you cook and eat and perhaps source your food? And, well, of course, your spices, it's changed, but what about more generally?
Yeah, so for spices, obviously, I use our own. But in general, what I do, I've noticed I am much more picky than before. So I always have paid a certain level of attention. But right now, I really pay attention to buy organic, to buy regional in priority whenever possible. So, and even if there is a higher price tag, because I know what the difference it makes as well on your personal health. And I look much more at labels. So whenever I don't buy fresh, whenever I don't know the origins, I really look at, okay, what is really in there? And because I know a little bit where the ingredients come from, I also know, okay, what's the likelihood of pesticides having been used? And I know, for instance, on many conventional products, if organic is not available, if the origin is Spain, for instance, I don't buy it, because I know Spain uses conventional quite a lot of inputs. So these, I think I am much more of a conscious consumer, and will accept not to eat certain things or not to cook certain things if I don't get them in the quality that I want. So, and I do cook much more myself now. I really take the time to really avoid processed food whenever possible.
And you have such amazing spice blends that really make anything taste good. So it makes it easier. Exactly.
If you have the right spices, cooking becomes easy.
Yeah, Absolutely. So I'm really interested in your personal journey. I know a bit about your background, and I think it's an interesting story. How did you sort of become the spice lady? So what event or series of events brought you where you are today?
So I think it's really a bit more of a coincidence. I never really planned to be exactly where I am today, but I've always just been lucky enough to be presented with cool opportunities. And initially, so I studied at the very beginning law and conflict management, then worked in a corporate for a few years in that space actually, and then after a while decided I wanted to do more, and that the corporate space alone was not fulfilling or not fully aligned with my values. Then did an MBA where I specialized in social entrepreneurship and impact investing, and that's certainly where I first got exposed to value chains and to these more social entrepreneurship practices, and got super interested in it. And somehow after that, and I wouldn't have known, frankly, also at the beginning, I was really one of the last one in my MBA knowing what I wanted to do, despite having actually taken the decision at the very beginning. I will know immediately, but actually it took me a long time to find out which direction I wanted to go. And then I worked for 3 years for Unilever. So I joined after my MBA, I joined Unilever, which I felt was a corporate which was very aligned with my values. And I must say it was quite a revelation, two sides, positive and negative. Like the positive side is really, I realized the real power, the sheer power of procurement, and particularly of procurement of private entities. And, Unilever at the time had bought for 35 billion a year of raw materials. And, when you see the size of recovery packages at the moment of COVID, which is also, and you're like, oh, it's so much. But when you think that such an economic player every year spends that amount on raw materials, you're like, well, if they bought differently, imagine the change they can make and the sheer economic power that they can have to influence value chains. And for me, that was really fascinating. I didn't quite realize it before that. On the other hand, what I did see is in these large organizations, and Unilever is really a progressive organization who has a lot of ambitions, who wants to do a lot, and they are really trying to be serious about it. However, you still see that the sustainability they promote on the ground is largely incremental. So it's not, because they need such big volumes and they don't have flexibility on price. So fundamentally, the sustainability doesn't really question the agricultural policies which are conventional, which push for inputs, which push for productivity. They don't, there is also this constant pressure on price, so they don't really have any leverage to say, well, we pay you more, or if you pay me more, it's so small. And often, the case that they had in Kenya, they increased productivity by 30%, but then the price dropped because of that equally. And so the farmer was left with exactly the same. Right. And these things, they're so inherent in a way, because if you can't give more to the farmer, at the end, if he has still, just so little to live by, then you don't really change the system. If you cannot push for more diversified agriculture on the ground, then you will continue depleting the soils, even if you do it in a slightly better way. It's not enough, so to say. And I think the level of ambition that's needed can only be shown by much smaller organizations ultimately, because these big players, they follow once they see others doing it. If there is enough small organizations that demonstrate that you can create a lot of value through procurement, through higher quality, they're not stupid, they will go for it, because they will see that the consumers will start moving over to a different quality. But that first needs to be proven. And that's a little bit why then there was a number of management changes in Unilever, I decided to leave and then had the opportunity to create the spice company. And because we have happened to have friends who were working on spice projects who wanted as well to create the brand, and that's all led then to us creating that spice brand, which was more of a coincidence. But then we said, let's do it. And at the time, it sounded like a very small risk. Let's try. And in the meantime, we've invested much more than initially planned, and it became a much bigger project. But at the time when we launched, went in there like every entrepreneur, quite naively, and just then stuck with the idea and got determined to push it through. So I think that's what led us to where we are today.
I think that's the best way to start. I think a lot of things wouldn't start if one realized what was actually involved in the process in the beginning.
Yeah, you would never do it. If we knew half of the things that we had to face, we would never have done it. So it's good to go in there as naive as possible, because then you actually have the strength to overcome the different obstacles that you face.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, you sometimes feel like a small piece of the puzzle. And that means that, there's the chance that you can feel frustrated, or that you're maybe not having the impact that you want, or you just, face a lot of challenges and don't have the same resources as big organizations to tackle them. So in those moments, what helps you to stay energized and inspired and focus and keep going?
So I think the one thing that always keeps us very energized is positive feedback from customers. So when we see customers being really enthusiastic about our product and really thanking us for doing the work, then you feel actually that you're serving someone, so that you're not doing it for nothing. So that is very energizing always. And the other thing I would say is when we visit the farmers and see the farmers, and they're like, well, how lucky are we that this is our job, to help these people to walk around in these beautiful gardens and to see how we can create value out of that. So it is very energizing to see the beneficiaries and to really be on that ground, so that it's not very abstract. We know who we're working with and we have this direct connection, and that for me is always very rewarding. The last thing is when I see big companies and the big restructuring and how slow things are, and the frustration of colleagues, like, oh, how lucky am I that I have a company that is fully aligned with what I want, with who I am, with my values, and where I don't have to go through these management frustrations because we are the ones managing it. So that's also, I think, the three things that I try to think about when I do feel frustrated or feel down, which as you say does happen. So
yeah, I think it's important to talk about it. We tend to, I know particularly founder stories are always shown in the spotlight with a lot of sparkles, but not always a lot of space to talk about what is challenging. And that's something I find interesting about you too. So you describe yourself as a climate activist and entrepreneur, because you actually split your time, as I understand it, between, a role in a bigger existing organization, Climate KIC, funded through the EU, and then your own organization. So I do something similar, and I know a lot of people kind of sometimes find it interesting. So I'd love to hear from you. How does that splitting your time like that help support your overall mission and help you cross-fertilize ideas?
Yes, I personally love what I call portfolio careers. So not having just one thing, but having multiple things. It's also a way to create resilience and hedge your bets.
I like that. I'm going to start using that term. Thank you. Portfolio career.
So I think Climate KIC is very different because it's really, as you say, it's a EU agency focused on climate innovation, and really it aims to create systems change. So it's really working with policymakers and really aims to transform entire places, value chain, by working across all levers of change. So really working and having this very systems approach and systems innovation to see how can we really transform entire systems and going a step further. And SourceBias in that context is a much more very focused intervention, concrete in one place, very much on the ground. And I think that they do actually complement themselves very much. So I didn't necessarily know it when I started at the beginning, but in Climate KIC, I often miss the concreteness, where I feel like we are so high up and it's so complex, and you feel that the change happens so slow, and okay, how can we, you don't always see actually the direct impact that you're having, because you're just part of a constellation that makes the impact happen. And on the other hand, and SourceBias is sometimes missed, like, oh, we're just such a small piece of the puzzle. How can we really make the difference or create the impact that we want to have in the food system? And I think this complements actually each other very well, because when I get frustrated with one thing, I can have the other, which balance each other out. And I must say as well, in Switzerland, I noticed that these two worlds are actually not very separated. So there is constant, when I go to Climate KIC events, there's constant people that I know as well through SourceBias and vice versa. So it's not like these are two different worlds. It's almost like SourceBias is a niche pioneering approach to demonstrate what can be done, while Climate KIC is much more focused on, okay, how do you take multitude of these pioneering approaches to then transform them into a systems change and work with policymakers to make them happen. And so in that place, it is quite complementary, and I really enjoy the combination.
Yeah, I have a similar experience. I like to be able to come at things from both sides. So we're coming up to this insanely busy time of the year, or we're already in the middle of it. So in these really busy periods, what are some of the most important things that you do to try and align your time and your energy with your values and your priorities?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's always difficult. Sometimes I think what I really try to do is to reflect a lot on as well what gives me energy and what doesn't, and adjust my work accordingly. So what I do much more deliberately is I know when I'm productive in the day, and I try to adjust as well what I'm doing in terms of work around that. So when I need to do more reflection work or more, really inspiring work, I know I do it more in the morning. In the afternoon, I tend to do more emails or things that I need slightly less concentration on. And also I do prioritize much more radically what I do and also what I don't. So learning to say no. And I'm lucky that I have in both organizations, both jobs, enough margin of maneuver to actually be able to say no when I see is that really critical? And I think that is quite important to be really quite radical on what you do and also what you don't do, even if people outside are then saying, but you should also do this and this and this. And yeah, I could do 1,000 times more things if I had more time. And I think it is also important in the whole thing to find a few moments where you actually think about neither of both work, so that you really are completely outside in the nature, having a walk or just doing cooking a great meal, where you actually really focus then on that thing, and where you try to push all the issues or all the things that cloud your mind in both worlds aside. So I really try to take enough time to meditate and to reflect and to take these moments. So because I have been overwhelmed in the past, and I really think preserving your mental health is super important if you want to continue. Otherwise, if you break down, then really you don't help anyone. So that's a few things that I try to do to keep sane in the busy organization.
Yeah, I think you hit on two really important ones. I'm running a leadership training program at the moment. We've spent quite some time in the last weeks talking about saying no and dealing with overwhelm, because particularly in this day and age, it's this feeling of, this fear of missing out, of never doing enough, of being enough. It drives so much that there's such a high risk of burnout if we don't learn to manage it and live in a way that's sustainable, so our impact can be sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sometimes requires a bit of a step back on, taking a step back on how emotionally you're involved in certain things. So if you have the impression that you on your own need to save the world, the pressure is so crazy. And women, I find, have that more, where we really feel, I need to do something. And then you feel, but it's so big, what can I, and to take a step back and say, actually, you can't do it on your own. And also to take it and accept that and say, look, I'm just I'm doing my very best, but also accepting that the very best is good enough. And to sometimes, I know that I really learned over the years to take a step back on emotional things. So if things don't go my way, I can live with that, and I just accept it and continue without necessarily that then bringing me down massively on my personal side, because that is tricky, I find.
And I think that's the challenge in this space. When you are very intrinsically motivated, it's very easy to link your identity with the work and with the impact and all of these things. And if it doesn't go how you expect, it can have a much bigger impact than necessary. So it's a lovely tip to step back. And so what would you tell someone starting their career wanting to change the food system?
So I think there is so many ways where you can start. So I think what is important is that you try to first understand and decide what are the different ways that you can have an impact in the food system. Because based on your profile or skills, you could work in the policy space, which is a very slow space but very powerful if you actually manage to change something, or being an entrepreneur, but actually trying within companies such as Unilever to push boundaries further and to be more innovative and to push, try to change the systems, let's say, from inside, which is, again, a very powerful way to do it. Or being an entrepreneur, which is the most risky way, where you probably have the biggest freedom, but also there is a big risk of failure, and you're you start from a much smaller place, so to say. So I think it's important to know what type of personality you are, because I think you can really have an impact across, and there is not just one way to do it. And it's important to know which personality, what level of risk are you able and willing to take at that particular particular time and basically make a decision on that. The other thing I think that is interesting or important to ask yourself is at which step of the value chain do you want to be? Are you working at the Unilever, which is very consumer facing, and where you then work more on also changing consumer behavior and mindsets, and where you change by being the last one? Or are you much closer? Do you work with someone that is actually buying, or are you really on the ground working with the people who produce and try to change their practices on the ground? And I think, again, it depends a little bit on personalities and where you're able to be located. So there's so many different ways. And I think just you're gathering an understanding of saying, okay, that's actually the best place. That's where I can personally create the biggest impact by being there. That is certainly the most useful, or that's how I would start if I had to pick and say, where do I want to be positioned, and where can I have the biggest impact?
And like you say, so much of it is also sort of chance and serendipity and what opportunities arise.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also realizing indeed you can change, or you can have an impact in so many different ways. So not to necessarily judge there is one better place than another, because they're all almost equal and they need to all come together. So there is not, so you can really have an equal impact by being very high up or being very close to the people on the ground. So there is, and if the more people move in general and try to have an impact in any space they are, the bigger the impact overall we will have.
And so regardless of where people want to work, is there one skill that you would suggest people who want to work in food systems build?
So as I mentioned, for us, partnerships were very important. And I still think, particularly as an entrepreneur, that partnerships are very important because you are so small. It's important to see with whom can you ally and with whom can you work together and where can you find win-win situations. And as I mentioned as well, we work a lot with development agencies who actually are looking for companies who are able to pioneer and who are able to go the extra mile on the ground to have these flagship examples. And our project in Sri Lanka gets visited, I think, every 2 months by some kind of high-level people, just to show what can you do, how far can you go, and what the organizations on the ground do. And so we really must say we're very thankful that these development agencies are there, because steering such big projects on the ground for a startup is extremely difficult. We have partnerships with chefs who try out our spices and then give us recipes that we can use, because actually we're very good on procurement. We have very solid skills there. And I think in our case, that is a critical skill. But in general, I think just knowing how can you create creative partnerships and with whom can you work, and constantly looking for who else can you ally with.
Yeah. Building your capacity to work in partnership, which I think for me links to a core skill of communication and collaboration. Yeah.
Collaboration, negotiation, understanding empathy as well, like understanding the others, where they're coming from. So it is a combination, but yes, I think being able to build these partnerships is quite important.
Yeah, absolutely. So the podcast is called The Grateful. And I like to ask all of my guests this question: what does living a great and full life mean for you?
I think it is in part certainly having work that is fully aligned with my values, because I at least spend so much time at work between both organizations that it is really important that I work on something that I feel where I have an impact and where my time is well used. I do feel it's still quite important, at least for me, it's very important to have good personal life aside, so a very good communication and a relationship with my partner, with my friends, with my family, and very good cooking time as well. So we do spend quite a bit of time cooking at home, and that is really a very relaxing time. And so we can really think that it is part of having good ingredients and really being able to cook a great meal. And what I always try to have is always having small things on the side that I love to do aside from work. So sometimes for a few months, and it's still like I have a succulent collection. I like to paint a little bit. So something completely unrelated, but which is just pure enjoyment for even a few hours a week, but where I can totally disconnect and really have other passions and not being only focused on work. So that's kind of the combination that I see for a great and full life.
Wonderful. Joy for the sake of joy. It's important we make space for that. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Grateful Podcast. If you liked it, then please go ahead and subscribe and share it with a friend. And I would love to get your questions answered here. So if there's something that you would like answered or explored on this podcast, just send me an email to podcast@thegrateful.com and I'll do my very best to get your questions answered here on the show. Music in this episode came from Blue Dot Sessions.